This month on Central Christian Church Crucial Conversations, we are talking about economic justice. Join us on Thursdays as we talk with guests who are engaged in the struggle for economic justice and listen to learn more about how you can get engaged. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Crucial Conversations with Central Christian Church. We are coming to you from downtown Indianapolis, and in our third series of podcasts, we are now talking about economic justice and the church's response to that. So today I am joined by two of my classmates from Dr. Kimberly Rassaw's Prophets class from spring 2020. And we were in the class with her talking about what the prophets have to say about poverty and if there are any connections between what the prophets had to say about poverty at the time they were writing and how we talk about poverty in the 21st century. I am joined by Janai Downs, who is a second-year MDiv student, and she is a member of Eastern Star Church and serves as on staff as Director of Family Life and Connections. And we are also joined by Michael Jefferson, who is pastor of Bethel AME Church in Plainfield and is also a second-year MDiv student along with myself. So thank you both for joining me today.
For having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So the first thing, just to jump into the topic, I remember signing up for the class when it was just called Prophets. And I was like, okay, I need to learn more about this. I'm one of those people who is scared of the Hebrew Bible, like not in the content, but just in the interpretation of it. There's so much there. It seems very difficult to suss out sometimes what's going on. And there's so much historical context to learn. But I was like, okay, I'm going to confront my fears and and learn about the prophets. Plus, I loved Dr. Rassaw's intro to the Bible class. So I was excited to take another class with her. So I was excited and nervous. But then when we got the syllabus and it was prophets and poverty, I was like, okay, here we go. We're talking about something that scares me and something that I love to talk about. So this is great. I really looked into that one. In terms of taking the class about the prophets, about poverty, was there something that you learned in the class that either changed or affirmed your own theological views about how you see the problem of poverty and the church's response?
So I will say, when I saw the syllabus and saw the poverty piece added, I was like, no, I just wanted straight prophets. I don't want anything extra, whatever. But I'm very grateful for the spin that she took, especially when we look at the times that we're living in now and economic justice and injustices that are happening. So I'm very grateful for Dr. Rassaw doing that spin, and I learned a lot. So it did do a lot of affirming of things that I was thinking before, but now thinking it very, very biblically. I love Matthew 25, which of course is New Testament, right? But Matthew 25 talks about Jesus is telling the folks he's talking to, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. So all of this sort of helping somebody else. And so to see the prophets literally saying, hey, children of Israel, you have gone crazy. You've lost your mind in the way you treat other people and how you're not making sure that needs are met. So it was amazing to go through that class and go literally through each of the prophets and see that. So it definitely affirmed what I've been thinking, but just seeing it more biblically was very helpful, I think, in our context.
Yeah, I'm the same way. When I looked at the syllabus, I think I might have had a momentary panic, but I think I do that every time I start a class. It's like, what am I doing here? Do I really want to do this? But I really appreciated the treatment, looking at a topic that I think about when we talk about there's prophets, and then there's our modern day understanding of the prophetic, right? And I think in some ways that's been co-opted by different groups that really talk about being prophets or the prophetic as sort of like soothsaying, right? Telling the future, rather than sort of speaking to what God's desire for the world is. And so looking at what God's desire for the world is, and then if we know that, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hill, and God came to give us life and life more abundantly, but there's still this issue of poverty. And so understanding that from jump, God has not been a huge fan of the poverty, and has been very clear about what God's people's response to poverty is supposed to be. And so it was it was an eye-opening thing for me, because it helped me sort of check some of my own embedded theology around prophets and the prophetic, but also sort of understand that prophecy and speaking and prophets, there's supposed to be some sort of a response to that. And so looking at it through the lens of poverty, I think was very helpful in understanding call to action is for those folks who claim to love God and follow the Bible.
I was one of the prophet that I chose to kind of focus in on for the semester was Amos, which I think for me, going into the class, I guess one of the things that I always assumed about the prophets, that it was talking a lot about like idolatry, like that's what the prophets were warning against. And there's that there. And of course, this is said with the major caveat of like, none of this is actually like set in stone of what we can't know for sure exactly what Amos was talking about or what Jeremiah was talking about. Like we can know a lot of what they were talking about, but there are, of course, arguments to be made on many sides of all of these issues. But for me, it like reading through the commentaries for the research for my final paper on Amos and poverty and related to housing in Indianapolis was this idea that God despised their festivals and their religious offerings because they were this like religious excess while so many people lived in poverty. And so for me, that was I think really really exciting to sort of get into. And then what I think becomes a little bit trickier, talking about the prophets being written in such a specific time and place with specific sort of governing structures that are very different from like the 21st century United States. It's like, okay, so how does this translate to now? I think that that is, of course, what we're all trying to figure out in our like church ministry is like, what sort of wisdom does the Bible have for how the church orients itself today? So before we get too much into that, like, how does your church or denomination see its role in, bringing about economic justice that is obviously so important to God in the prophets?
My pastor mentioned actually just recently about how maybe 5 or 6 years ago, as he was kind of seeing this vision from God on what to do with the community in regards to like community development and all that. And he talked to the mayor, and the mayor is like, go one block at a time. Just make sure that you are doing your part in regards to building the community. And so that's what our church started to do. So we started the Rock Initiative. I think had to have been about 5 years ago now. And that literally is about economic development. So we have, I think, 12 or 14 homes that were either newly built or rehabilitated in the Arlington Woods area. We also heavily support 2 schools. So there's an elementary school on our campus of our church. There's a high school that just started, and we heavily support that. We heavily supported the technology piece that's in the elementary school. So literally, as a church, the congregation gave money. Our tithes and offerings went to this initiative to make sure that people in that area can live normally, right? And not live in this impoverished state. So if I'm not mistaken, there was nothing new in that area. This is 46218 that I'm talking about in Indianapolis. There was nothing new in that area for well over 30 something years. I mean, literally to the streets being very raggedy and all that stuff, potholes that were never sealed up, any of that. So the church was very instrumental and saw it as its vision and its goal to make sure that while we have this mission of evangelism and discipleship, we actually play it out in a social expression. And our social expression has been about community development. So we have a grocery store that's there because at this point, it's a food desert. And so how do we make sure that people have healthy food options? So we put a market there. We put some affordable housing, affordable apartments. So there are 25 apartments in this one building that we built. There's a bank that's there. So a lot of people who did not have bank accounts, did not have direct deposit, all the stuff that we sort of take for granted, we made sure to bring that into that particular neighborhood. So that's our church's take on it through the Rock Initiative, to make it, just kind of one block at a time, community development.
Yeah, so in the AME church, so there's a couple of different ways that we approach it. There we do have commissions on economic development, and there are churches that will, from the smallest level, look at doing food distribution and reaching out and helping to ensure that folks have access to food where if they might live in a food desert, or they might not have access to good or reliable transportation to get to the place where they can get food. Several of our churches have community development corporations that range getting grants to reach out and support and create that economic investment within their communities, all the way up to organizations. And several of our churches own and have owned apartment buildings and have rented out their parsonages, and several of those, and not just rented them out, but rented them out at substantially below market rate for the sake of making sure that folks are well housed. I will say that we are we're an old denomination in terms of just years of existence, and it's fluctuated, right? And so when the church is riding high, there's a lot of investment, or there can be a lot of investment in the community. But when the church is sort of fluctuating on the other end, sometimes our investment in the community lags, and we become more insular. And so I say that because I think, to bring it back to what we were talking about with the prophets, there is this sort of admonition to be community minded consistently, right? Because people aren't just impoverished when there's a lot of money in your bank account. People are impoverished all the time, right? The poor and the sick you will have with you always. So we approach it from several different ways, but for the most part, our focus has been on housing and food.
Yeah, and I think that something that you just mentioned, Michael, made me think of another Dr. Russell class that we're in right now on womanist and African-American biblical interpretation. And we recently read an article that I brought up in our first podcast session about give them what you have. And sort of a womanist reading of the Feeding the 5,000. And this idea of people giving out of their lack instead of their excess. And I think that there is obviously a biblical mandate for that. We don't see that, I think, as much in the prophets, because we're talking about obscene wealth gaps. And so there's, but when it comes to the church, especially the church today, and when, attendance is declining, it, kind of across the board, it is for the mainline, for evangelical churches, I think that we see, so again, the parallels aren't exact. Like, I don't know that the disciples of Christ are sitting on like an obscene amount of money. I may be wrong about that. But this idea of then how do we, as a church, still faithfully address poverty that's always with us. But then also, I think, how do we look at obscene wealth gaps in our world today? Because it's not, obviously those still exist, but it's not necessarily with a group that, God has made a covenant with. So, I don't know if Jeff Bezos has made a covenant with God that he's breaking, and someone needs to get over to him and be like, hey man, you're breaking the covenant. So what is the church's role now when we see like really obscene wealth gaps between the rich and the poor, but also the racial wealth gap? This is something, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, we have our our own personal mandate to become like an anti-racist church, and for a predominantly white mainline, I think that's one of the questions that we have to be taking seriously, is like, how can we use whatever influence we have and the money we have, the resources we have, to address some of these gaps that allow some people to live with so much, to the point of really obscenity, and while some people cannot survive. So any thoughts on how the church can not only give to people who are suffering now, which I hear that in both of what you guys are talking about. Yeah. Is there something the church should be doing about these huge gaps?
So I think you bring up two things. And so what's funny is you brought up Jeff Bezos. And the first thing I thought of was his former wife, Mackenzie Bezos, and the way that she, following their split, inherited a lot of money and then started just distributing it. I'm an HBCU alum. I'm a member of several Black organizations, and she became the money fairy. Like she just started, you get $50 million, you get $50 million, you get $50 million, right? And so she made these donations. I know one of them is to $50 million to Prairie View A&M University, which is an HBCU in rural Texas that has been doing amazing work since 1876, but has not been adequately. And so what she did was she made a radically transformative gift to an organization that's been doing great things. I say that to say a couple of things. I think the church, where it has the resources, can be an agent of change, right? I think where the church may not have the resources, but it has a voice or it has feet, must be the arms, the legs, and the voice of change, right? And so we think about this economic justice issue. If you have a church like a mega church like Eastern Star is doing exactly what it should be doing, right? Not just marshaling its resources to build a massive edifice. And we've seen some of these churches, some large mega churches that have created multi-million-dollar cathedrals, but have like a minute amount of impact around them. And so when we see large scale organizations, your impact should be proportional as well. And so I would imagine, for a church full of 10 people, like, my church behind me, should we be doing nothing? No. Should we be doing something? Absolutely. And so we do what we can with our group. To that end, if somebody who walks in and they have $1 million, I should ask them the question, how are you giving back? What are you doing to end the economic injustice in the world? Because at the end of the day, the money isn't the root of all evil. The love of it is, because the love of money will make you do things like not pay people a living wage. It'll make you hoard your money. It'll make you have an ex-wife who makes you look kind of like a miser, even as one of the richest men in the world, right? And so I think the church has an obligation where it can to do what it can, but where it can't, to speak truth to power. Because though most of those millionaires and billionaires are sitting on someone's pew.
And feeling good about themselves for giving a little bit.
Because feeling good a little bit. Like a little bit, not even tithing, right?
Right.
Just a little bit.
So a lot of people don't feel like there is an obligation per se to give to help people. It's just kind of like, hey, I give a little something, and it's a tax write-off. And so I've done my part. That's kind of how some people feel about their riches. And that's unfortunate. One thing I think the church has to keep in mind is, and this goes beyond the church and beyond the covenanted people of God, it goes to this idea of we won't give unless we feel comfortable giving, unless we feel like it meets our standards and, that kind of thing. But when I think about what the prophets were saying, and even what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 25. He never said, when I was hungry, you fed me after you found out what got me to that place. So, or, I was in prison and after you realized that, I was actually innocent and that's how I got in prison, then you helped me. It wasn't that. It was literally not questioning how we got there, but literally just saying there's a need. Someone is there. Someone is hungry. Let me feed them. Someone is thirsty. Let me make sure they don't have any clothes. Let me make sure they're clothes. Healthcare. Let me make sure that's there. So instead, we see a lot of people who have great riches and they have an abundance of resources, but they hoard it because they love it and because it doesn't, other people are not meeting their standards as to how they should give. That's
and how they should live, right?
And
yes. You were hungry, but you didn't vote the right way, or you were thirsty, or you were naked, but I wonder how you got there, and because I don't know how you got there, I feel like you shouldn't. Or I have money, so now I'm going to use it to sway political parties to make sure that you stay hungry. We pick what food you get to eat. And so, when we think about this, that love of money being the root of all evil I love what money gives me the ability to do. It gives me access. It gives me power. It gives me influence. It means that my opinion, right, wrong, or indifferent, now has sway because people want my money. And so I fall in love with what money gives me. And then I become this wonderful, wonderful person that Janai just described.
And I would even say there's probably, it seems to be a sect of people who keep people poor, right? And literally it's a conscious thing. So, when Jesus says, you'll have the poor among you always, there are some people who are literally like trying to make that happen. So that's why you don't see the living wages. You see kind of very, very low minimum wage, or you see people just keeping people down. And that's very unfortunate. But we see that it had to have happened with the children of Israel, with the prophets. For there to be X amount of 12 prophets, the minor prophets, to keep saying the same message to the children of Israel. Hey, stop oppressing people. Make sure you take care of the widows, take care of the orphans, take care of the foreigners. Like all of this stuff that they had to keep saying and keep reiterating lets me know that there's nothing new under the sun. We're still dealing with some of the same issues, and there are people who are trying to keep people oppressed.
And it kept escalating, Janai, right? It was like, no, for real. I know the last guy said it, but we mean it. Like,
we mean
stop this.
Right.
Like,
or else. There is an or else.
Or else, right? And so I think part of it, to your point, Janai, I think we also have to call out some of the difficult and problematic theology that has created this sort of bootstraps thinking around it's like, God has blessed me and and if you do these 17 things, God will bless you too, which is not biblical. But there is this sort of I read an article about what happened to Christian churches and their theology and their preaching around the time of the rising of the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, right? Because they weren't just super rich, they were also super visible and super rich, right? You think about the Rockefeller Centers, the Carnegie Libraries, their wealth was fully on display. And so what preachers unfortunately did was they shifted some of their theology and the way they talked about being blessed to the wealth, to the trappings of wealth. And so our idea and our thought around what it means to be prosperous shifted to whether or not you live like the Rockefellers, or in today's terms, the Kardashians, right? From what it means for your soul to prosper. Yeah. And to a degree, one of the things, it's not just the millionaires and the billionaires, right? It's also some of our churches who are more willing to spend like $500,000 on a building upgrade or a sanctuary upgrade or a musical instrument than creating $500,000 a year initiative to help end or address poverty. And so you look at this, what would have happened if the boy who had the 2-piece and 5 biscuits would have told Jesus, this is mine. I worked for it. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. Tell those 5,000 people they need to go find themselves bootstraps and get their own 2-piece and 5 biscuits. You wonder, but what's interesting is you see a lot of people who today, if Jesus was to walk up and say, hey, can I just have your lunch? Would say no.
Right.
I appreciate what both of you are lifting up here in that some really problematic theology that blames poverty on the poor. When, you see, I was looking back over some of my notes from the class, like with Amos, it's like, a lot for the people in like the deepest poverty, it's not just about like, they're working incredibly hard. Like there's this so many myths about people who are poor, and they're working very hard. And these elite people at every turn are designing their society so that hard work doesn't matter. Like you're working hard for me because you're poor. So like, taking advantage of one of the lines in Amos is about, taking advantage of people who are in debt to you and they don't even have shoes. It's like you have pushed this debt system to a like really evil place, like where you're making these people work the shoes off of their feet. And so I think, and we see that now where, there is sort of this prevailing attitude of like, well, I worked really hard and that's why I'm successful. And I think we need to be unpacking the myth behind that too. It's like, if hard work was the only thing it took to be successful, then everything will be completely backwards. Like, you talk about like, oh, well, Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, like they started in their garages, they had nothing. And it's like, well, they didn't have nothing. They started off like way high up here, stratified with like investments from their parents or like there's
the ability to drop out of college and not have to work for someone else.
Right.
So yeah, I think we see there's myths on both sides. I think the church can be helpful in addressing of like, just because someone is successful, it doesn't mean it's like a blessing from God. It actually could be because they're exploitative and bad, like the opposite of that, and then also peeling back these narratives about people who are living in poverty, it's somehow their fault, when you can point to a lot of other reasons why they are in many ways trapped. So we are closing in on time for today, but I wanted to, before we left, I wanted to bring up the pandemic because one of the things we've talked about a lot in our seminary classes and our churches is like not going back to the way things were before.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so we're coming up on, not the end of the pandemic, the next phase, we'll say, of the pandemic. So now would be a good time to really be thinking about how we're not going back to the way things were before. But I'm starting to be like, ooh, I think a lot of people would just like things to go back to normal. Like, because, and partially because, this past year has been terrible. And they want something not terrible in their lives. And they know that, so like a lot of it is very understandable. So, but I would love to hear from you both. This prophetic literature is talking about like, let's not go, we've been destroyed by God once again. Let's not go back to the way things were before. And, they cycled through this 12-ish times. So they weren't super successful either. But if you had something to say to the church, your church, the church at large, about how do you see not going back to the way things were before? And you can speak about that as specifically or broadly as you would like.
So I think you're right. There are a lot of people who are very quick to say, I just want to get back to normal. And the pandemic has shown a lot of people whose eyes have opened, I would say, because not everyone's eyes are open still. But it has shown a lot of people what these gaps look like, whether it's wealth gaps, whether it's educational gaps, any type of, just businesses, whatever, work this idea of I worked for mine, you have to work for yours. You must not be working hard enough. That's why you don't have enough. That's why you're struggling, all of that stuff. And so there are certain mindsets that are there, but some people, their eyes are open. Some people see like, wait a minute, this has been pretty bad, right? Even when we talk about racial injustices, now people are seeing that a lot more, whereas before, perhaps some kind of way, I think maybe when we look at the Social Dilemma, that movie or film or whatever that was on Netflix, that where it's sort of information is skewed according to who's, looking it up and all that stuff. And I'm like, this is just crazy. But it lets me understand too, how if I Google something based off of my context, these are some things that are going to pop up. Grace, yours is going to pop up differently. Michael, yours is going to pop up differently. So that's very interesting in this time where information is very available to us. So it's odd when I can see things a certain way, but my neighbor sees something completely different. So my neighbor is thinking, I want to go back to normal. And I'm thinking, no, please, let's not go back to normal, because the way I see normal, it was bad. So we have an opportunity, I think, as a church to make sure that for the things that have been televised and we can view it across the world, and we're seeing these different gaps and all of that, and we're seeing the effects of the pandemic and especially poverty on people, then we have to figure out how not to go back to normal. And so I think about Jeremiah was saying, he's like, hey, be careful of some of these other random not prophets who are telling you that, they're lying. They're saying that everything's going to be cool. We're not going to be here for a while. He's telling the children of Israel, be careful. We're actually going to be in Babylon in this captive state for a while. So don't listen to those folks. But while you are here, listen to God. What God is saying is build houses, make sure you get to farming, make sure you have some produce here, build family, because we're going to be here for a while. And the reason we are here is because when it was warned before that you should treat people well, not oppress people, get rid of this poverty and all of that stuff, that's the reason why we're here, because we didn't take heed to that warning. So I think that's going to be very important for the church to have this message of let's not go back to normal. Let's look at what it is that has turned on its ugly head, and let's make sure to reverse some of that. So where we see a need, let's meet it. When we have resources, when we have friends, when we have people around us who can make change, let's literally try to make change instead of letting it be as it is. I think that's the church's responsibility. That's a very difficult one because not everyone is on one accord. But the church is supposed to be on one accord. We literally are the body of Christ. So what is our move? Our move is to get on one accord, understand the issues, and do what we can where we can.
Yeah, I completely echo all of that, Janai. I think when we talk about normal, who benefited from the former normal, right? Who got to define what normal was? Right. Who was centered in the prior normal? If we think about even the poor, the sick, and the widowed, those were the three people who were the most impacted by COVID-19. Poor doesn't have access to health care, the sick, pre-existing conditions, which mean that you're going to have a much likelier negative response to COVID. And the widowed are older people and those folks who do not have active caretakers and caregivers in their homes. Those were the ones who ended up being the most impacted by it. And even when we think about the poor, the sick, and the widowed, those are also your sick and shut in folks. Those are folks who could not get to church before. And so now that everybody had to, so I read an article about how COVID-19 showed us just how a lot of disabled folks were like, so basically everything I've been asking you to do for me for the last 15 years that you told me you couldn't do, you magically did. COVID-19 made everybody the poor, the sick, and the widowed. And so we rallied around each other. We created access for one another. My company would never have allowed remote work, but now it is our daily life. And so we're looking at all of these things. And so how do we go from normal to, as Desmond Tutu's book writes it, God's dream for the world? And so how can we talk about shifting from what is normal, because it's not normal, it's just what we've accepted.
Right.
It's what we've made our peace with. It is what we have made ways of doing, thinking, and being around. And so how do we shift from what we've accepted to what God has expected? And so I personally think I really don't want normal. I've never wanted normal. I want exceedingly abundantly beyond what I can ask or think, because that is what has been promised to us. And to be honest, that is what God commands us to not just receive, but to work toward. And so normal didn't serve me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Normal, it was still normal when Trayvon Martin was shot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was still normal when Sandra Bland was killed. It was still normal when the Emmanuel 9 were gunned down.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in an abnormal state. George Floyd is gone. Mm-hmm. And now we have 2 more names that we can say. And so I'm not interested in normal. I'm interested in God's dream for the world. I'm interested in the prophetic, because it is possible, becoming the present. And that is the message to the church. What's your skin in the game? Are you more invested in becoming adjacent to the oppressor,
mm-hmm.
and having all the trappings of not upsetting the oppressor?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you interested in God's dream for the world being expanded for everybody? And so I know that's what God wants. It is not going to be an easy transition, because listen, I like all my trappings of being oppressor adjacent. I really do. But if I can't drive down the street without feeling guilty, if I can't go to the doctor without knowing that this is not something that everybody else can do,
right?
If I can't pay my bills and live in a nice neighborhood, and then but not think about certain zip codes I wouldn't dare live in, I got strength for the world.
That's good, Michael, too. Just this idea of, yes, in the normal, some of us lived fine, right? The issue, though, is some of us live fine, but with a consciousness for those who did not.
Yep.
So that's the normal we cannot get back to. That's the acceptance that has been going on that we cannot get back to. So we got to have a consciousness for those who are not well off and things are not working out well for their lives. And what's our role in that? Can I read Luke chapter 4 right quick? Grace, you get that smile, because this is Jesus quoting the prophet Isaiah. Okay. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. I love that he quoted that. That was like his first, kind of sermon. He goes into church when he came back home, and he opens the scrolls and he reads from the book of Isaiah, and people are like, what in the world is happening here? This is intense. But I love how Jesus is like, hey, I actually came for this. This is what I've been anointed to. And so there's 2 pieces that we see in that. He's anointed to preach to the poor, and then to the non-poor, the ones who are making people poor. So our response, though, as the church, is to make sure that we're speaking to both of those audiences. So there's an audience of people who don't have a whole lot and who are really struggling. And so it goes back to that article you brought up, Grace, about kind of the sacrificial giving, give what you have, and knowing that God will take care of you. The other part is speaking to those who have an abundance and making sure you understand you have a role to play in this. You also are supposed to give and help. There should be, with so many billionaires, there shouldn't be anybody hungry, anybody thirsty. We don't have to ask the question, well, how did you get here before I can help you? We just got to do it. So.
Yep. And I'm 100% with you, Janai. It is the acceptable year of the Lord.
Yes. Yeah.
Where the Lord defines what is acceptable.
That's right. That's right.
And so that is not where the rich decide, not even where the poor decide, because the other thing is that God doesn't want us flipping the script where the poor now become wealthy and start oppressing the wealthy who are now poor.
Right.
And so it comes back to Jesus was talking about this. There's a reason they wanted to kill him. And so if we're preaching a gospel that don't make nobody want to throw some darts at us, like you have to wonder, why are people so comfortable with this message of Christ?
Yeah.
These prophets were not at mega churches. They might have been in schools of prophets, but there were people who actively hated them. Mm-hmm. And so there was a reason they had to keep with the same message. And it's because, when it comes down to it, economic justice is a part of God's expectation. Yeah. It's the reason why when you got to the end of Martin Luther King's life, we talk about the prophets, right? It's a prophetic message that remarkably begins in the Bible and persists all the way up until today.
That's right.
And so that is, we have the messages there, but why are we still having to learn the same lesson?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you both so much for being here. This was such a great conversation. I think that you guys both raised some great questions and also just some great advice to the church. And I also, so thank you both for being here. And I also just want to shout out once again, Dr. Russaw, for designing classes that grow legs and go far beyond the scope of the classroom. So
yeah,
absolutely.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank our listeners for listening. And we are excited to continue this conversation next week.